Welcome to Eastern Europe's Minorities in a Century of Change, a podcast on the history of minority experiences in Central and Eastern Europe during the 20th century. I am Oleksii Chebotarov, a postdoctoral fellow at the New York College Institute for Advanced Studies, Bucharest. This series is a part of Institute of Historical Research Centennial Commemorations, our century, looking back, thinking forward, and has been organized by the Basis Study Group for Minority History. It was made possible through the help and support of British Association of Slavonic and East European Studies and the Stanley Barton Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Leicester. The study group is a forum devoted to researching minorities in the national and regional histories of Central, Eastern, and Southeast Europe and promoting closer scholarly collaborations. For more information, please visit our website at studygroupforminorityhistory.com. In today's episode, Yohanan Petrovsky-Shtern, the Crown Family Professor of Jewish Studies and Professor of Jewish History in the History Department at Northwestern University, talks to us about the Jewish communities in the late Russian Empire and the Soviet Union and the challenges in framing this history. Yohannan, welcome to the podcast. Can you start by telling our audience a little about yourself and how you became interested in this particular aspect of history?
Well, I believe I started my career as a scholar of comparative literature, and I was teaching in East Europe for about 5 years, a little bit more, as a associate professor of comparative literature. I taught courses in the history of the modern novel from Cervantes to Thomas Mann. I was teaching the introduction into aesthetics, and of course, theory of literature from Plato to Lotman, many other courses, and that was in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Then things happened in my life, and I had a kind of reawakening, due to which I decided to leave the area of literary studies and move from a kind of a mythological, secluded environment of literary texts into the study of linear historical events. They are, as I realized much later, not necessarily linear. They can take different forms, different vectors. But I moved into history. I had, in the mid-1990s, a kind of intermediary period when I was more interested in things connected to sociolinguistics. Sociolinguistics brought me to the discovery of newly declassified Judaica manuscripts at different depositories in the post-communist world of Russian Federation, Lithuania, Belarus, Poland and Kyiv, and then these manuscripts turned me once again 90 degrees to the historical, I would say things historical, and since mid-1990s I consider myself a historian who is studying the different aspects of East European Jewish history.
Thank you. For benefit of our listeners, how would you generally define the Jewish population in the late Russian Empire and the Soviet Union? Why has the concept of minority has been applied so widely to the Jews, even though we know from your and other studies that they were often not a minority in the communities where they lived?
Well, if we look at statistics and demography, we will realize that in the entire region of Galicia, Jews constituted approximately 13%. But if we look at specific towns, be it Kolomea or Stanislavov, or for example, Lviv, and of course, if we move from bigger towns to smaller towns to, let's say, Drohobych to Belz, we'll find out a very interesting curve, so to say, on the diagram that shows 30%, 40%, 45% of Jewish population. So what kind of minority we are talking about? Well, Jews have been an exterritorial population. That is to say, they are not associated with any kind of state boundaries in the 18th, 19th century. Therefore, the only way at that time to characterize them was to look at them as the minority. However, we have to resort to the 18th century scholars who discussed the private Polish towns that were later called shtetls, and these historians, such as Moshe Rossman, Gershon Hundred, Adam Teller, have written in their books that Jews in these private Polish towns constituted anywhere from 25 to 70%. So of course they are not a minority, but because they are exterritorial, the word minority was applied to them. The study of minority of that type of exterritorial ethno-national group is extremely complex because it requires deep knowledge of the context of urban context. If we look at Lviv, Lemberg, and it would be the context of the Austrian Empire. Sometimes we need to look at the Polish context if we are talking about, let's say, Rivne, Berdichev, or Ostrog. If we move forward, we would need the context of Soviet state and before the Russian Empire. So we need to constantly shift the context. We are looking at, for example, one of the same Jewish ethno-national group living in an urban environment from the 16th century to the 21st century, and we do see that this ethno-national group changes the context in which it operates and the majority with which it interacts over 4 or 5 centuries. The knowledge of this context is absolutely crucial.
And to continue this talk about changes, I also would like to ask you about the diversity and divisions among Jewish communities in Eastern Europe. There is, of course, some common understanding of religious, language, class, and other diversities inside Jewish communities. But could you please tell us more about how it functioned on the micro level of shtetl and what actually happened to this Jewish diversity with the advent of the Soviet state?
Well, there are 3 caveats we have to take into consideration. One is what time we are talking about. If we are talking about 18th century, we'll have one type of division. If we are talking about early 20th century, it'll be a very different one. So we also have to take into consideration the geographic area where this ethno-national group is residing. And third, we need to know how we approach this minority. We look at the class, or we look at gender, or we look at religious denominations, and so on. I would say that if we look at the 18th century, early 19th century, the time period that I studied and about which I wrote a book, The Golden Age Shtetl, I would say that the ethno-national Jewish communities are located in the territory controlled by the Russian Empire or in the territory controlled by the Austrian Empire. So this is due to the partitions of Poland by Prussia, Russia, and Austria from 1772 till 1795. We also have, at that time, Jews residing in Poland proper, but Poland proper doesn't exist as an independent country after 1795, which means that we can talk about Polish Jewish areas of residence within the Russian Empire. So looking at the divisions within the within different Jewish localities, I would say that from the class perspective, we are dealing with First and foremost, 10 to 15% of paupers, about 60% of people who are in retail trade and different types of artisanry, and well, 60% up to 80%, and not more than 5% of the Jewish oligarchy, which is composed of international merchants, Jews who are in finance, purveyors of the army, and other types of the nascent Jewish bourgeoisie. Of course, the more we move into the 19th century, the more robust the upper class becomes, and the more is the tendency of the middle class to pauperize and look for the blue-collar employment in bigger urban areas. So this is kind of a Marxist approach to the divisions within the Jewish community, and of course, this is all. I would say kind of a first approximation. We need really to zoom in and see the enormous difference between different towns. I would say if we look at Rachmistrivka, which is a shtetl, and at Berdichev, which is a shtetl, we'll find out that from our today's perspective, a town that has 40,000 people would be considered a town or a city, whereas in the documents, Berdichev still figures as the private Polish town. It was in the possession of Radzivill's until the 1860s. And so demographically, statistically, it is without any doubt a town, maybe a small city, but on paper, it appears as a shtetl. So what do we do with that? We just acknowledge that particular demographic statistical difference that needs to be taken into consideration when we talk about Jewish settlement. On the other hand, we do have religious divisions, and religious divisions are quite interesting and very much misunderstood. So the last quarter of the 18th century saw an enormous expansion of the trend known as Hasidism, which is one of the trends of religious enthusiasm that really had their enormous impact on the life of Jews and non-Jews in the late 17th, early 18th century Europe. So the Jewish trend, Hasidism, of religious enthusiasm, is part of that all-European pietistic movement. Hasidism really, according to the scholars of the previous generations, split the Jewish community into the so-called mitnagdim, those who were against Hasidic movement, and Hasidim who were into this pious, enthusiastic religiosity. And for, I would say, 100 years, historians were telling us, well, we have Hasidim, pietistic Jews on the one hand, and their more rational opponents on the other. The first were mostly in Galicia, Crown of Poland, and Polish Kingdom, excuse me, and the southern part of the Pale of Jewish settlement in the Russian Empire, Volhynia, Podolia, and so on. Whereas the Mitnagdim, another group, was in Lithuania, in what today is Lithuania, at least, and partially Belarusia. And there, of course, these historians who are basing their models on the Hegelian vision of the history of ideas, they saw the Jewish community as split between these two groups. When you actually look at what is going on at the grassroots level, you will see that the situation is much more complex. And the majority population is neither Hasidic nor Misnagdic, and uses the religious authorities in both realms for their benefit. A person can use the prayer book that is Ashkenazic, that is to say, does not reflect the influence of the pietistic trend in Judaism, but when a person has a sick relative, this person would take a note and go to a tzaddik, to the Hasidic master, asking for his blessing, asking for his intervention on the behalf of the sick person before the Almighty, which means that the person kind of finds his or her way in between the two trends, and it is an interesting comparison that one of my mentors at Hebrew University, Shaul Stampfer, used to describe the situation. He was saying, we thought that Jews can eat either milk or fish, either milk or meat. That is to say, to be either Misnagdic or Hasidic. But actually, the most population was parv. Parv is a Hebrew word that designates the produce that is neither dairy nor flesh, no meat. So the majority population was this parv population that did not attach itself to any of the camps. So this is the traditional religious divisions within a shtetl in the 18th and most of the 19th century. We have to take into consideration that the trends that also had a sweeping effect on the Jewish life in the Germanic lands and in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I mean, first and foremost, the Reform and later conservative Judaism. These trends had little, if any, impact on the Jews in the Russian Empire. There were attempts to establish Reform synagogues that were called progressive in the Austrian Galicia, or Reform synagogues and communities that also called progressive in St. Petersburg and Odessa. They did not bring any results. So schools in the 19th century could have been closer to progressive Judaism, but the congregations appeared only outside the Russian Empire. There were 0 progressive congregations in the Russian Empire for a variety of reasons, but that particular important division of Jews into conservative, Reform, and traditional, that were later called Orthodox, does not exist in the Russian Empire. So we can talk about other differences. We can talk about gender functions in the Jewish community, but it will be for another conversation.
Thank you. And to the second part of my question, so how you can briefly describe what actually happened with Sovietization of this land? So is it some immediate changes that happened, or we also can see some lasting dynamic with this particular diversity and divisions among Jewish communities?
Well, if we look at the Great War as the moment of separation of the previous life of the Jewish communities and what came later, we need to acknowledge that we are dealing with several areas. First, we have robust Jewish communities in now independent Poland. There are very significant Jewish communities that are on Czechoslovakian territory and in Austria, and of course most of them appeared in the Russian Empire territory that now, after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, found themselves on the territory of what would be, after 1922, the Soviet Union. So as we know, the Soviets started a devastating anti-religious campaign, published the journal Bezbožnik, which is known under the title Epikoiros in the Yiddish world, Yiddish-speaking world. So the Russian authorities basically introduced changes on all levels that were targeting Jewish community and in general traditional communities in the Russian Empire, not only the Jews. And this campaign ended up influencing the Jews in different ways. Well, religiously, I would say the Hebrew language was outlawed and from any kind of schooling, and Yiddish was imposed on the Jews as the language of democratic, Marxist-minded proletarians. Hundreds of synagogues were closed, and only one synagogue was allowed to exist in a big town, which means that many Jewish religious people had to move to underground, teach and pray, at home, risking their freedom because of their religious activities. On the level of, I would say, literary artistic activity, the 1920s cannot be compared to the 1930s, because Jews moving into big urban centers really became extremely visible as editors of the newspapers, as writers, and as people who are going to the masses and reading their literary works to them. So you have this particular explosion of Jewish literary and cultural and artistic activity that my colleague Kenneth Moss called the Jewish Renaissance in the Russian Revolution, right? But all of that ends up in the 1930s because the national communist trends that were that were found commendable in different minority groups in the 1920s, that particular trend, that particular vision of national communism was curtailed, disrupted, and people who represented it were basically executed. So we do see a very important attempt of the Soviet system of social engineering that was trying to establish new Jewish elites in the 1920s to channel the communist idea to the masses. And once this idea, captivated the masses and galvanized Jewish masses, the Soviets started to get rid of the elites on different levels in order to more forcefully introduce a Soviet type of assimilation. So this assimilation in the 1930s through the 1980s brought about quite a number of, I would say, devastating consequences for the Jews, one of which is basically the conversion of a Jew into a Homo Sovieticus. And Homo Sovieticus is a person without ethno-national roots. Homo Sovieticus is a person who is inscribed into the Soviet type consumerism, and Homo Sovieticus is a person who is loyal to the Soviet state, Soviet symbols, and Soviet glorious past, connected first and foremost to the Second World War, which it was called in the Soviet Union Great Patriotic War. So when we are talking about Soviet Jews of the 1970s, 1980s, these are people who are absolutely split from their, traditional Judaic values, and they are more Soviet people than the Jewish minority in the Soviet Union. That is the result of enforced assimilation that the Soviets were conducting starting from the late 1920s. I can talk more about that and emphasize economic and other aspects, but from the point of view of religious aspect, this is, I think, what is going on.
Thank you for this broad but still very insightful overview. And coming a bit back in time, so you mentioned one of your major publications, the Golden Age Shtetl, which was interestingly not only influential in academic circles, but very much noticeable for non-academic audience. And in this regard, could you please shed some light for our audience as to why scholars consider the Shtetl to be such an important historical phenomenon, and how can you explain this lasting presence of the Shtetl and its associated myths in mass culture and historical imagination?
Well, before the period modernization kicks in the let's say, if we are talking about the Russian Empire in the mid-19th century, before that time, most of the Jews live in those private Polish towns that are hundreds of them. You'll see on the map anywhere from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea area, and anywhere from Smolensk to let's say Poznan. And the fact that the majority of Jews lives in this area reshapes our vision of who Jews are culturally, ethno-nationally, politically, socially, and economically. Let's not forget that 2/3 of the world Jewry in the 17th, 18th century lives in East Europe. So in that territory that would be later called the Pale of Jewish Settlement, 15 provinces in the western part of the Russian Empire, plus the Kingdom of Poland. So if 2/3 of the world Jewry lives in that particular place, and the majority of those who live there live in the Shtetl, in those Polish private towns, it means that the Shtetl is an example of quintessential Jewish residence, quintessential Jewish dwelling. And then the Shtetl phenomenon is associated with the entire East European Jewry. Therefore, when the Shtetl is destroyed in the First World War and then practically wiped out in course of the Second World War, the Shtetl is no more existing in its with its infrastructure, its Jews, its elementary and different other types of education, with its ethnographic traditions and so on and so forth, which means that the Shtetl is no more there. But the Shtetl in the 18th century represented the place, the locus where most of the Jews live at that time. And therefore, scholars consider the Shtetl as the phenomenon that they call, and I call, the Atlantis of the Jewish world. So this Atlantis disappeared, but when we look back at it, we are interested in the archaeology of the Atlantis, in the sociolinguistics of the Atlantis, in the economic aspects of the Atlantis, in the connection between the Atlantis and the so to say outer space, the surrounding world. In the hierarchies of the community in this Atlantis. So we are talking about the revival or reconstruction, I would say, of that particular Jewish Atlantis that allows us to look at what Jews were, what the majority of Jews were, anywhere from late 14th century till the mid 20th century. So it's also varies from place to place. I would say if we are talking about Pinsk, we are talking about 700 years of Jewish presence. If you were talking about Ostrog, we are talking about 400 years of Jewish presence. So, that particular time span doesn't change that idea that I mentioned, that when we talk about the Shtetl, we are talking about the place where absolute majority of Jews lives in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. Of course, late 19th century and rapid Russian industrialization, when Russia is trying to catch up with the West after Prusso-Frank War, that particular period of time pushes Jews out of the Shtetl into the big urban centers, and they settle in Gomel, in Minsk, in Odessa, in Dvinsk, in Lodz. And that changes the dynamics within the Jewish world. And basically, we are witnessing the creation of the big Jewish enclaves in the late 19th, early 20th century urban centers. Jewish life in these centers is very different from the Jewish life in the shtetls, and that is kind of a new era. We are talking about an urbanized Jew who is, as they put it in the 19th century, a Jew at home and a human being in the street. That very much changes also the outlook, the modus vivendi of the Jews in both in the territories controlled by Austria, in the territories controlled by Czechoslovakia, Poland, the Russian Empire, and the Soviet Union. So that is already a new urban Jew who sees himself as a person who rejects his previous shtetl outlook, ridicules it, writes about it, satirical works, and tries to establish himself or herself as a person of the city, not as a person of the shtetl.
Thank you. That's extremely interesting, but I think we have to move to the second part of our conversation, in which I would like to talk about your research experience, and maybe you will agree to share some professional self-reflection with our listeners. And in already mentioned context of Jewish intersectionality and this complex history of relations with surrounding communities and different political systems, what is your research strategy in creating a meta-narrative for stories of these Jewish individuals you study?
Well, look, I need to argue with the way you formulated the question. I never look at meta-narratives. I despise meta-narratives. I think they can be used in the last two sentences of your research paper, article, or a book. You can just point to a meta-narrative saying that it is wrong. Most meta-narratives are wrong. And for myself, the moment I started to get interested in historical research, I was very much interested in microhistory. And the more I was zoomed in, the better was the result. Therefore, I would say that there are people who can write excellent meta-narratives. Timothy Snyder, in terms of the 20th century Europe, and others. Maybe I can write a meta-narrative, but I'm really not interested, and I built myself for the last 25 years as a person who works in the methodological realm of, let's say, Carlo Ginzburg, the Annals School, and of course, I'm orienting my scholarship looking at Marc Bloch, at Leroy Ledurie, and other towering figures of the Annals School, which means that I'm emphasizing microhistory, not macrohistory, and meta-narrative belongs to macrohistory, not microhistory. I started my career when I was invited to create an inventory of Jewish manuscripts and books in different languages, Judaica books, at the declassified, humongous declassified collection of books and manuscripts at the Vernadsky Library of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. And I spent 2.5 years selecting for myself a bunch of manuscripts that were called Pinkasim, that is to say, the record books of Jewish communities, with only one caveat. These were not the record books of the communities, but rather record books of the societies, voluntary Jewish societies that were focused on this or that particular mitzvah, on this or that particular commandment that the group belonging to the society was trying to emphasize, promote, and bring to practice. So I was sitting and rewriting, copying these manuscripts by hand. And I was learning Hebrew, I was learning paleography, I was learning rabbinics, I was learning the social life of the Jewish shtetl-based world. by just copying and analyzing this Pinkasim, this record books of the Jewish communities and societies. The collection that I was working on at the time had about 85 to 90 of those Pinkasim. These are thick manuscripts. And when I was doing that, I realized that I'm interested precisely in that particular point, working with specific community in a specific town and looking at things that other people were never looking at because nobody had access to these manuscripts. And thus these manuscripts changed my life. So instead of teaching theory of literature from Plato to Lotman, I came to discuss, let's say, a little a small town or a Jewish traditional society acting in one of the Russian regiments after the conscription of Jews in 1827. One of my friends who knows and reads my translations of Borges, Cortázar, Garcia Marquez, other writers, and who knows, that when I'm working as a literary scholar, I'm really working on huge themes, new Latin American narrative, Anglo-Catholic tradition in English literature, and so on and so forth. So he told me how crazy you should be to exchange, to replace Borges with those disgusting, record books who nobody needs and who nobody reads. I laughed, but basically what I was doing precisely that. I was leaving the world of meta-narratives, going to the world of micro-histories, and I'm still there. And when people ask me why I do not write a book about the shtetl, let's say Berdichev, that is established in the early 16th century, bringing it to today, you can do that, they tell me. I'm saying I'm not doing that. There are plenty of people who do write excellent meta-narratives and create them and recreate them, let them do that. I have my little shtick, and I'm kind of cleaving to micro-historical approach.
Thank you. Let's now talk about the more traditional research field, their functions and limitations, and how scholars can influence or be influenced by their specific area of scholarship. Many of your works can be identified as the history of Russian Jewry. At the same time, you are also one of the few scholars promoting Ukrainian Jewish studies as developing research field. So how do you position yourself professionally?
Well, if I write a book about Russian Jewry, it doesn't mean that I write about Russian Jewry. I mean that in the context, let's say, of the 19th century, early 19th century, late 19th century, we are talking about Jews in the Russian Empire. So these are not necessarily Jews that are Russian Jews. These are Jews of Russia. If some of them become Russian Jews and are acculturated into the imperial milieu, that would be a different story. But I'm talking about Jews who are Jews in Russia. That is, I'm talking about geographic kind of loyalty or geographic association. When I'm talking about Ukrainian Jews, I'm discussing an absolute minority, tiny minority in the late 19th, early 20th century that are that have a tendency to associate themselves with Ukraine, and that can be anybody from, let's say, Hrytsko Kornirenko, who starts a Jew from Gulay-Pole town, who starts writing in Ukrainian language, and up to Jabotinsky, who writes in Russian but associates himself with the Ukrainian national revival. Yes, in many cases, I'm talking about Ukrainian Jews in my recent books, but I'm not talking about Ukrainian Jews associating Jews, all of them, with the Ukrainian statehood. I'm talking about Jews of Ukraine. Of course, among them are Jews who are cleaving to Ukrainian culture, and I am discussing these Jews. But these are also a minority that that had to be seen against the backdrop of the Jews who are Homo Sovieticus wherever they are, in Georgia, in the Russian, in Russia proper, or in Ukraine. Finally, I would say regarding my work on Ukrainian Jews, that Jews who are Ukrainian Jews, they are of course a minority among the greater Jewish population. But look, among Ukrainians, you have the same Ukrainians in the 19th and 20th century who are conscious of their Ukrainian roots and who build themselves as an ethno-national group of Ukrainians cognizant of its Ukrainian association. These people are absolute minority also among Ukrainians. Ukraine was deeply colonized and Russified, and only the events of 2004, Orange Revolution, 2014, Revolution of Dignity, really shook the Ukrainian world and brought thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians to that position when they associate themselves precisely with Ukrainian national values. So that particular change also shows that Ukrainians who are associating themselves who see themselves as Ukrainians, not just geographically located group, they are also in minority. So I do not see any kind of difference between, let's say, Ukrainians and Jewish Ukrainians. We are talking about elitist groups in the 19th century. But I'm very much interested in these elitist groups because what they do, as Benedict Anderson taught us, they are channeling the new type of ethno-national loyalty to the greater masses. You do have people who, like Josef Zisius, like Leonid Finberg, like the late Moisei Fishbein, who were constantly telling Jews in Ukraine, we are Ukrainian Jews. Many people heard that. Some people follow this path, but still it is a process, and we are in the midst of it.
Thank you. And in our conversation, Ukraine today was mentioned many times, not only Ukraine, but also many shtetl, small towns that are located in contemporary Ukraine. And of course, it's not only due to your Kyivan roots or close ties to the country. So many of your works suggest that there is urgent need to reevaluate the role of Ukraine and Ukrainians in broad Jewish history. And here I'm speaking not only about your book about shtetl, but also about your other major publications, the anti-imperial choice, the making of Ukrainian Jews that you just mentioned, or Jews and Ukrainians in a Millennium of Coexistence, co-authored with Paul Robert Magochi. How would you describe the key aspect of this re-evaluation of Ukraine, which you are seeking to undertake within the field of Jewish history?
I would say that reevaluation is not only about Jews in Ukraine, but also about Jews in the Russian Empire. And this reevaluation, which I connect to recontextualization, really helps us better to understand what is going on grassroots level in different Jewish communities and with Jewish individuals. You mentioned a couple of books that I wrote recently. Let me start with this. Most scholars, most of my colleagues, when they discuss anything related to Jewish history, when they start writing their books, articles, or giving talks, they see themselves speaking to broader audience, but when they really want to say what they are doing, they balance what they are saying against the backdrop of other scholars, what other scholars have written, what other scholars have said. I am doing a little bit different thing. And therefore, I think I have sometimes an opportunity to reach a much larger audience. I am looking at what people think, what the lay reader understands and sees. Yesterday, I was giving a presentation on Ukraine, nothing Jewish in my presentation, only just the situation during Russo-Ukrainian war. And my listeners, a big congregation in Montreal, told me that, well, how can I talk about Ukraine in this positive light when, most of us people in 60s, 70s associate Ukraine with rabid anti-Semitism. So what I can tell them is a different story, but my point is that I'm always thinking about the bias of people and the received wisdom that people have. So I'm coming to debunk these bias. And of course, you can compare me to, if you want, to a Don Quixote who is fighting the gigantic mills. I do think that fighting the bias is very much a Quixotesque action, but this is exactly what I'm doing. So I start by saying this is what most people think, and this is how their received wisdom shapes what some historians write and what most people think. So this is exactly what I am talking to when I'm writing my books. So when I'm writing the book Jews in the Russian Army, I know that most people think that once you are in the Russian Army, you are no more Jewish. And I'm showing that at least 2/3 of the Cantonists, that is to say, Jewish children, Jewish underage boys who were drafted into the Russian army, first and foremost into the military schools that were called at the time Cantonese battalions, they remain Jewish. And the figure of the Jews who came through the Russian army and remained Jews is in the I would say 96, 97%. So what I'm saying really flies in the face of what people know, what people think about Jews in the Russian army. And that comes an absolutely unexpected thing. When I'm teaching, let's say, when I'm giving a lecture on Jews in the Russian army at the International Genealogical Society, I'm not a big fan of genealogy, but doesn't matter. I'm coming to give a talk. I have, let's say, 300 people in the room. I would hardly have this particular group if I talk about what this historian said, what that historian said. I am talking to people who have this idea that, once you are in the Russian army in the 19th century, you're no more Jewish, and I'm coming to tell them that's not true. The same thing is with the let's say, Ukrainian vector of Jewish acculturation. Nobody has been talking about that. How can you acculturate into Ukrainian peoplehood and support the idea of Ukrainian nationalism when, as people's bias tell us, Ukraine had been always anti-Semitic and very bloody, and this waves of Ukrainian revival always brought about humongous, terrible pogroms and devastated the Jewish world. So how can you integrate Ukrainian culture when it is, so much vitriolic, so much poisoned with vitriolic anti-Semitism? And I'm saying, really? This is what you think? So let me look at a number of cases that absolutely challenge this idea. And I'm saying, well, Ukrainian revivalism is supported by a number of Jews, and these are very well-known names. So let's ask a question: why Jews support Ukrainian revivalist movement, and what they find in it, and why it is important for them to integrate Ukrainian culture. So I remember I was sitting at the conference at Barlan University, and next to me was Evgeny Satanovsky, the person who was one of the big one of the big tycoons in Gazprom, and he was also at that time a very good pundit, political analyst, and I'm giving a talk about Ukrainian Jews associating themselves with the Ukrainian cause after 1991. And I was preaching that we should look at this, Ukrainian elites who associate themselves with Ukraine. So Satanovsky turns to me and says, this is the first time I hear about that. And, we are here to discuss the Russian Jewry, and what you are doing is really, he used this funny word, perpendicular to what we have to say. I'm saying, well, just revisit what you think, revisit what you know.
Thank you. Thank you. And finally, where can our listeners go to learn more about these fascinating topics?
Well, I can send you the list of books, but if you are interested in what I'm doing, all my books are on Amazon, and you can get The Golden Age Shtetl, which I presented at Oxford, Cambridge, and the University of College London, giving lectures about this book. You can take a look at my Golden Age, at my Anti-Imperial Choice book, which was awarded the Encounter Canadian International Prize last year, and won and it was awarded by the American Association of Ukrainian Studies. There are books out there that you can consult, and I believe that I'm building kind of a field of Ukrainian Jewish studies, educating new generation of scholars such as Artem Kharchenko and Oleksii Chebotarov. These people, these students of mine, they also produce very interesting work looking at the intersection of Jewish Austrian, Jewish Ukrainian, Jewish Polish history.
Thank you. Thank you for your time and for this very insightful talk, Yohannan.
All the best. Thank you.